I never thought my life would turn into a nightmare because of two dogs. Looking back, I should have seen the signs when Steve first moved in with his German shepherds, Zeus and Apollo. But I was still lost in grief over Mom's death, and maybe Dad was too. That's probably why he married Steve barely a year after we lost her. I remember the day they moved in. I was 16, trying to be happy for Dad, who seemed to smile more around Steve. The dogs looked intimidating, but Steve assured us they were perfectly trained. That should have been my first warning. The way he said it, like he was proud of how much control he had over them. "They're trained protection dogs," he told Dad, petting Zeus's dark fur. "They'll keep the family safe." Dad ate it up, probably thinking about how Mom's cancer had left him helpless to protect her. But I noticed how the dog's eyes never left Steve, how they tensed up whenever he made a small hand gesture. The first few weeks weren't too bad. Steve played the perfect stepdad, cooking dinner, asking about my day, even offering to help with homework. But then came the security measures. It started with Steve insisting the dogs sleep in the hallway outside my room. "Just to keep you safe, sweetie," he said with that smile that never quite reached his eyes. Dad didn't think anything was wrong when Steve started tracking my phone. "He just wants to make sure you're okay," Dad said. "You know how dangerous it is for teenage girls these days." I tried to explain how suffocating it felt, but Dad just reminded me how lucky we were to have someone who cared so much about our safety. Then, the training sessions began. I'd hear Steve in the backyard speaking to the dogs in German. At first, I didn't pay much attention, until I noticed how they started reacting whenever I tried to leave my room. One bark from Steve, and they'd plant themselves outside my door, their low growls making it clear I wasn't supposed to pass. "They're just being protective," Steve would tell Dad whenever I complained. "Maybe she's still not ready to accept our new family," he'd add with a concerned look, and Dad would nod sympathetically. That's when I started noticing how Steve was always there when I tried to talk to Dad alone, how he'd interrupt with some household emergency or work question. My best friend Lily was the first to notice something was wrong. "Those dogs give me the creeps," she told me after trying to visit one afternoon. Zeus had blocked her path until Steve called him off, apologizing about their overprotective nature. After that, Lily's mom stopped letting her come over, saying our house didn't feel safe with such aggressive dogs. I tried reaching out to Mom's sister, Aunt Sarah, but Steve had already laid the groundwork. "Poor thing's having such a hard time adjusting," I overheard him telling her on the phone. "We're really worried about her mental state since losing her mother." By the time I got to talk to her, she was already convinced I was troubled. The day I realized how trapped I was came when Steve caught me trying to climb out my window. I'd gotten desperate after he started making the dogs bark whenever I touched my doorknob. He didn't yell or get angry. That would have been easier to fight. Instead, he just looked sad and concerned as he called Dad. "I think she's having an episode," he said while the dogs stood guard. "I really think we need to consider getting her some serious help." That night, as I lay in bed listening to Zeus and Apollo's steady breathing outside my door, I finally understood. Steve hadn't trained the dogs to protect me. He'd trained them to keep me prisoner. And somehow, he'd managed to convince everyone that it was for my own good. The worst part? I had no idea this was just the beginning of my nightmare. Things got worse faster than I could have imagined. Steve's control tightened like a noose, and I watched helplessly as my world shrank to the size of my bedroom. The dogs became his perfect weapons, silent and intimidating, responding to commands I couldn't understand. Every morning, I'd hear him outside my door, whispering to them in German, and their low growls would remind me that I was trapped. Dad started pulling longer hours at work, and I barely saw him anymore. When he was home, Steve orchestrated every interaction. "Sarah seems withdrawn today," he'd say with practiced concern, placing a hand on Dad's shoulder. "Maybe we should give her some space." The painful part was watching Dad nod, believing he was doing what was best for his troubled daughter. I tried to keep track of my disappearing freedoms in a diary I kept hidden under my mattress. First, it was my phone. Steve convinced Dad I was obsessively texting friends about dark thoughts. Then, my laptop time got restricted because I was spending too much time in unhealthy online communities. When I tried to argue, the dogs would start barking and Steve would sadly shake his head. See how agitated she gets? This is exactly what I'm worried about. The worst part was how he turned my few remaining friends against me. Take Jenny from my chemistry class. She'd been trying to check on me after I started missing school. One day, she managed to get past the dogs to my room, but Steve was ready. I heard him in the hallway, voice thick with emotion, telling her about finding disturbing writings in my room. "We're just trying to keep her safe," he said, "but sometimes I worry we're not doing enough." After that, Jenny's texts stopped too. My teachers started getting emails about my mental health leave, all sent from my school account that Steve now controlled. When my English teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, tried to visit after I missed 2 weeks, Steve put on his best performance. The dogs sat perfectly behaved as he explained how I was getting professional help. I screamed and banged on my door, but Steve had already told her about my episodes. My cries for help just proved his point. He was methodical in his isolation tactics. Every time I tried to reach out, he'd already laid the groundwork. Phone calls to relatives were monitored, with Steve hovering nearby, ready to interpret my concerning behavior. He told Dad I was having paranoid episodes, convinced everyone was against me. The cruel irony was that fighting against his lies only made them seem more true. The dogs became more aggressive with their guarding. Zeus would bare his teeth if I even touched the doorknob, while Apollo's bark would bring Steve running. "They can sense when you're upset," he'd say, making it sound like they were protecting me from myself. I started counting the hours by their patrol patterns, the click of their claws on hardwood becoming the soundtrack to my imprisonment. One afternoon, I managed to get a note out my window, hoping to catch Mrs. Chen next door's attention. Within minutes, Steve was in my room, dogs flanking him like soldiers. "I found this outside," he said, holding my crumpled plea for help. "I think we need to have a serious talk with your father about residential treatment options." The threat was clear: try to get help, and he'd convince Dad to send me away somewhere even worse. I watched through my window as Steve charmed the neighbors, explaining away any concerns about the barking or my absence. "Teenagers, you know," he'd say with a sad smile. "We're doing everything we can to help her through this difficult time." People would nod sympathetically, probably thinking what a dedicated stepfather he was, dealing with such a troubled teen. The breaking point came when I overheard him on the phone with Aunt Sarah, telling her I was already in a mental hospital. I was right there, locked in my room, listening to him describe imaginary therapy sessions and manufactured breakthrough moments. "The doctors are very hopeful," he said, while I pressed my ear against the door in disbelief. "But it's best if she doesn't have visitors for a while." That night, I tried one last desperate attempt to reach Dad. I waited until Steve was in the shower and called out to him through my door. "Dad, please, you have to listen to me," I begged. But Steve must have trained the dogs for this too. They started barking before I could finish, drowning out my words. When Dad came to check what was wrong, Steve was already there, fresh from his shower, explaining how my outbursts were becoming more frequent. I cried myself to sleep that night, feeling more alone than ever. The dog's steady breathing outside my door reminded me that every move I made was being watched. Every attempt at freedom would be twisted into proof of my instability. But as I lay there in the dark, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was rage, maybe desperation, or maybe just the realization that no one was coming to save me. If I wanted to escape this nightmare, I'd have to save myself. And to do that, I'd need to learn to beat Steve at his own game. The dogs weren't just my prison guards, they were the key to my freedom. I just had to figure out how to turn Steve's weapons against him. As I drifted off to sleep, I started forming a plan. Steve had spent months teaching his dogs to keep me trapped, but he'd never considered that I might learn something from all those training sessions too. I might be locked in, but I was far from giving up. This was just the beginning of my fight back. Living under Steve's control taught me to notice patterns. The dogs had their routines, and so did he. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., he'd take Zeus and Apollo for their walk, leaving me with 30 precious minutes alone. I started using this time to practice the German commands I'd been secretly recording on an old phone I'd found in my desk drawer. Mom had given it to me years ago, and thankfully, Steve didn't know it existed. The isolation was getting worse. Dad barely looked at me during our supervised dinner times now. Steve had convinced him that maintaining a calm environment was crucial for my recovery. Any attempt to speak up was met with Zeus's warning growl, followed by Steve's practiced sigh. "I think Sarah's getting agitated again," he'd say. "Perhaps she should eat in her room tonight." Dad would just nod, his eyes never meeting mine. I documented everything in my hidden journal: dates, times, conversations. The pages filled up with Steve's lies, each one building on the last. He told my school counselor I was in a private treatment facility. He told Mom's best friend Linda I was in a wilderness therapy program. To Aunt Sarah, it was a mental hospital in another state. The stories varied, but they all served the same purpose: explaining why no one could see or talk to me. The first time one of the dogs actually bit me, I thought it might finally open Dad's eyes. I'd been trying to reach the bathroom when Apollo snapped at my ankle, breaking the skin. The pain was sharp, but the hope that bloomed in my chest hurt more. Surely Dad would see this wasn't right. But Steve was ready, as always. "She tried to run again," he told Dad, voice heavy with false concern. Apollo was just doing his job protecting her from herself. I watched Dad's face as he accepted this explanation, and something inside me broke. But that bite changed something else too. As I sat in my room, pressing a stolen first aid kit against my ankle, I noticed Apollo watching me through the crack in my door. His eyes seemed different, almost guilty. That's when I realized something crucial. The dogs weren't naturally vicious. They were trained to be this way, which meant they could be trained differently. I started spending my alone time studying dog training videos on my secret phone, using the neighbor's Wi-Fi that barely reached my window. I learned about positive reinforcement, command structures, and most importantly, how to establish trust. During Steve's work calls, when he'd shut himself in his office, I'd whisper to Zeus and Apollo through my door, offering bits of my breakfast as treats. Slowly, painfully slowly, they started responding. A quiet "sits" would make them sit, just like it did for Steve. I practiced the pronunciations obsessively, matching the harsh German consonants I'd heard through my door hundreds of times. Each small success felt like picking a lock on my cage. The real breakthrough came 3 months into my imprisonment. Steve was on a long call with my school principal, spinning elaborate tales about my treatment progress, when I heard the familiar click of dog claws approaching my door. But instead of their usual growls, there was silence. I whispered, "Platz, lie down," and heard both dogs settle onto the floor. My heart nearly burst. They were listening to me. That same day, I overheard something that chilled me to my core. Steve was talking to someone on the phone, thinking I was asleep. "Yes, the same arrangement as before," he said quietly. "The insurance money's almost accessible. Once that's done, we can look at long-term care facilities." The pieces clicked together. Mom's life insurance policy. Dad had mentioned it would fully mature on my 18th birthday, just 2 months away. Everything made horrible sense. The isolation, the stories about my mental state, the push for residential treatment. Steve was setting up for something bigger. He wasn't just controlling me. He was laying groundwork for something worse. The thought of being shipped off to some facility, trapped even more completely while he and Dad had access to Mom's insurance money, made my blood run cold. I started testing the dog's loyalty every chance I got. When Steve would shower, I'd practice more complex commands. Higher, come here, blibe, stay. Each success was terrifying and thrilling. The dogs were starting to look to me just as much as they looked to Steve. They'd still follow his commands, but there was confusion in their eyes now, a split loyalty I hoped to exploit. The stakes became even clearer when I caught Steve replacing my prescribed vitamins with something else. Through my barely cracked door, I watched him empty my pill organizer and refill it with different capsules. That night, I pretended to take them but spat them into a tissue. The next morning, I felt clear-headed for the first time in weeks. He'd been drugging me, probably to make me seem more unstable. As my 18th birthday crept closer, Steve's mask started slipping. His concerned stepfather act would crack sometimes, showing glimpses of cold calculation beneath. I caught him studying me during dinner once, his eyes sharp and assessing, nothing like the warm worry he showed Dad. He knew I was watching him too, and his smile turned ugly. "More pills might be necessary," he told Dad later that night. "She's becoming more unpredictable." But Steve had made one crucial mistake. In teaching his dogs to be my prison guards, he'd given me a chance to turn them into my allies. Every command they learned from me was a key to my freedom. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Zeus and Apollo's steady breathing, I knew I was running out of time. My birthday was 6 weeks away, and Steve's plans were accelerating. I needed to act soon, but I had to be smart about it. One wrong move, and I'd lose everything. The dogs were my only chance, and I had to make it count. Time became my enemy and ally both. 4 months had passed since my imprisonment began, and each day brought new challenges and small victories. My window had become my lifeline, not for escape, but for watching Steve's patterns. Every Tuesday, he'd have a lengthy video call with his investment group. Thursdays, he'd spend an hour at the gym. These precious moments of freedom helped me piece together my plan. The dogs were responding more consistently to my commands now. I'd discovered that Zeus, despite his fiercer appearance, was actually gentler than Apollo. During Steve's shower one morning, I managed to get Zeus to bring me my phone from where Steve had hidden it in the hallway drawer. My hands shook as I quickly copied down important numbers before sending it back with the dog. "Good Junga," I whispered. "Good boy." Just like Steve did. But Steve was getting suspicious. The dogs weren't barking as quickly when I moved around my room, and their growls lacked their former conviction. I caught him watching them one evening, his eyes narrowed as Apollo's tail wagged slightly at the sound of my voice. That night, the dogs' training sessions in the backyard got longer, harsher. I could hear Steve's commands getting sharper, angrier. Dad was almost completely under Steve's control now. "The doctors think isolation is best," Steve would say, and Dad would nod like a puppet. I hardly recognized him anymore. His shoulders permanently slumped, his eyes always tired. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at Mom's picture when he thought no one was looking, and I wondered if somewhere deep down he knew something was wrong. The pills Steve was giving me got stronger. I kept spitting them out, but just touching them made me dizzy. One morning, I made the mistake of actually swallowing one, and the world went sideways for hours. Through my haze, I heard Steve telling Dad that my episodes were getting worse. "We might need to consider more intensive options," he said, his voice thick with fake concern. "I know a private facility." That was when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. My birthday was still weeks away, but Steve was laying the groundwork to have me committed before then. I started sleeping with my journal and old phone tied to my body with a shoelace, terrified he'd find them during one of his room searches. The evidence I'd gathered felt both powerful and useless. Who would believe a mentally unstable teenager over a concerned stepfather? The turning point came during one of Steve's Tuesday video calls. I was practicing commands with the dogs when I heard him mention Mom's insurance policy. "Once she's in long-term care, accessing the funds should be simple," he was saying. "The documentation of her instability is thorough." My blood ran cold. He wasn't just planning to commit me, he was going to use it to get Mom's insurance money. That same night, I had my first real breakthrough with the dogs. During Steve's shower, I managed to get my door open without them barking. Zeus and Apollo just watched me, their eyes alert but not aggressive. I took 2 steps into the hallway, heart pounding. "Blibe," I whispered. "Stay." They stayed. For 5 precious minutes, I stood in the hallway, free. When I heard the shower stopping, I rushed back to my room, but something had changed. The dogs had chosen me over Steve. But my victory was short-lived. The next morning, Steve brought in a new lock for my door, one that locked from the outside. "It's for your own safety," he told Dad while installing it. "She's been getting up at night wandering. It's dangerous." I watched Dad help him put it in, feeling sick to my stomach. The cage was getting smaller, but at least I had allies now. I spent that night planning. I had to time everything perfectly. Steve's patterns, Dad's work schedule, the dog's training. One mistake would ruin everything. I wrote down every detail in my journal, drawing maps of the house, noting every creak in the floorboards. The dogs watched me work, their eyes following my movements. They knew something was coming. The next few days were a careful dance. I had to make Steve think he was winning, that his increased security was working. I took the pills he gave me, but didn't swallow them, stayed quiet during meals, played the part of the subdued patient, all while waiting, watching, planning. Every night, I practiced the commands with Zeus and Apollo, their responses getting sharper, more immediate. Steve's mistake was in underestimating me, in thinking that months of isolation had broken me. He didn't realize that every day of imprisonment had only made me stronger, more determined. He thought the dogs were his tools, his weapons. He never considered that they could tell the difference between cruelty and kindness, between control and care. As I lay in bed that night listening to Steve's footsteps downstairs, I knew I was ready. Tomorrow was Tuesday, video call day. Dad would be at work and Steve would be distracted with his investment group. The new lock might keep me in, but it also meant Steve had to open the door to check on me. One opening was all I needed. The dogs would be my way out, and Steve's perfect prison would become his own trap. I touched the journal tied to my waist, feeling the weight of months of evidence against my skin. Tomorrow, everything would change. I just had to be brave enough to take my chance when it came. As I drifted off to sleep, I whispered a quiet thank you to Zeus and Apollo. Tomorrow, we would all taste freedom. Tuesday morning arrived with the same routine: Steve's footsteps, the jingle of dog collars, the sound of the front door closing for their morning walk. But today was different. Today, every sound mattered. I waited by my door, counting the minutes until they returned. When I heard them come back, I started my mental countdown to Steve's video call. The past few days had been the hardest. Steve had gotten more controlling, if that was even possible. He'd started checking on me randomly during the night, making me show him I'd swallowed my pills. I'd gotten good at hiding them under my tongue, but each check was terrifying. The dogs would stand in my doorway during these inspections, and I could see the confusion in their eyes, torn between their old master and their new friend. Last night, I'd overheard Steve finalizing details about a treatment facility in Idaho. "We can have her transferred next week," he'd said on the phone. "The documentation of her instability is extensive." My stomach had churned at his cold efficiency. He'd already planned everything: how to get Dad's signature, how to access Mom's insurance money, how to make me disappear completely. At exactly 10 a.m., I heard Steve's office door close and the familiar sound of his video call starting. I pulled out my old phone and sent the text I'd prepared days ago to Mom's best friend, Linda. "Emergency. Please come to house at 10:30. Bring help. I'm not in treatment. Steve's kept me locked up. Dogs won't hurt you anymore. Please hurry." Linda was my only hope. She'd known Mom since college, and even though Steve had convinced her I was away getting help, I knew she'd at least check. She lived 10 minutes away, and more importantly, she was a retired police officer. If anyone would know what to do, it would be her. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I could hear Steve's voice droning on about investment opportunities, completely unaware that his perfect plan was about to crumble. Zeus and Apollo lay quietly outside my door. They'd stopped their aggressive guarding days ago, but Steve hadn't noticed, too confident in his control. At 10:25, I heard car doors closing outside, multiple cars. My heart started racing. This was it. I waited, listening as footsteps approached our front door. The dog's ears perked up, but they stayed quiet when I whispered, "Still? Stay quiet." Then came the knock. Steve's voice stopped mid-sentence. I heard his chair scrape back, his footsteps moving quickly toward my door. When he opened it, Zeus and Apollo didn't move. They just looked at him, then at me. The confusion on his face was almost comical. "What did you do?" he hissed, grabbing my arm. The front door knocked again, louder this time. "What did you do?" But I wasn't scared anymore. "Zeus, fast!" I commanded. The attack command I'd heard Steve use so many times. Both dogs jumped up, growling, not at me, but at Steve. He stumbled back, his face white with shock. "Police! Open up! The voice from outside was clear, authoritative. Steve's grip on my arm tightened painfully. If you say one word, he threatened, but I cut him off with another command. Here! I called to the dogs, and they moved to stand beside me, teeth bared at Steve. His face contorted with rage and disbelief. The front door burst open. I heard Linda's voice calling my name, followed by multiple footsteps rushing in. Steve tried to pull me back into the room, but Zeus snapped at his hand, forcing him to let go. The dogs formed a protective wall between us, their training now turned against their former master. She's up here! I shouted. I'm here! Everything happened fast after that. Police officers flooded the hallway. Linda rushed to me, her face pale with shock as she took in my appearance. Steve started his performance immediately, talking about my mental state, my episodes, my need for treatment. But the evidence was clear. The lock on the outside of my door, the pills in my room that weren't what he claimed they were, the hidden phone, the journal documenting everything. And then there were the dogs. The way they stood guard over me, responding to my commands, showing everyone exactly who had been the real threat all along. When a police officer approached me, Zeus and Apollo remained calm at my word. When they tried to handcuff Steve, he yelled a command at the dogs in German. They didn't even flinch. The dogs were supposed to keep you trapped, Steve spat as they led him away. How did you... They protect people from threats, I told him quietly. You just didn't realize you were the threat they needed to protect me from. Dad arrived home to chaos. Police cars, animal control, neighbors watching from their yards. The look on his face as he realized what had been happening under his own roof was something I'll never forget. He aged years in those few minutes, listening to Linda explain everything they'd found. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, getting my first medical check in months, I watched animal control approaching Zeus and Apollo. Wait, I called out. They're not dangerous. They were just following orders. Let me show you. One by one, I demonstrated how well-trained they actually were, how gentle they could be. The officers watched in amazement as the supposedly vicious dogs responded to my every command with perfect obedience. That night, as everything was being sorted out, Steve in custody, Dad in shock, police documenting everything. I sat on our front porch with Zeus and Apollo beside me. Linda brought me a blanket and a real dinner, tears in her eyes as she apologized for not realizing sooner. The dogs stayed close, no longer my prison guards but my protectors. What happens now? Dad asked quietly, his voice breaking. I looked at the dogs, then at him. Now we heal, I said. All of us. Zeus put his head in my lap, and for the first time in months, I felt truly safe. The days after Steve's arrest were a blur of police statements, medical examinations, and tearful conversations. The evidence against him was overwhelming. My detailed journal, the illegal pills he'd been giving me, the recordings on my old phone, and dozens of witnesses coming forward about his lies. But the most damning evidence came from his own computer, where police found emails discussing his plans for Mom's insurance money and researching facilities known for keeping patients long-term with minimal oversight. Dad was shattered. He spent hours sitting in Mom's old reading chair, staring at nothing. I caught him crying more than once, looking at pictures from before Steve came into our lives. I should have known, he kept saying. I should have protected you. The guilt was eating him alive, but I couldn't comfort him yet. I was still dealing with my own trauma. The media got wind of the story, of course. Stepfather uses attack dogs to imprison teen made headlines, though most of the articles got it wrong. They painted Zeus and Apollo as vicious beasts, trained to terrorize a helpless girl. They didn't understand that the dogs had been victims too, forced to be weapons until they found a way to become protectors instead. Animal control initially wanted to put them down, claiming they were too dangerous. I fought hard against this, spending hours demonstrating their training, showing how they responded to gentle commands. Linda backed me up, using her connections in law enforcement to bring in expert trainers who confirmed what I'd been saying. The dogs weren't naturally aggressive. They'd just been following their training. In the end, they let us keep them, under the condition that they pass a series of behavioral assessments. Nights were the hardest. Even though my door now had no lock, even though Zeus and Apollo slept peacefully in my room by choice, I'd still wake up panicking, thinking I was trapped. Dad would hear me crying and stand helplessly in my doorway, not sure if he had the right to comfort me anymore. The dogs would sense my distress and move closer, their warm bodies reminding me that I was safe now. The investigation revealed more about Steve than we'd ever imagined. He had a history of similar schemes, marrying vulnerable single parents, isolating their children, attempting to access family funds. He'd never gone this far before, though, never kept someone prisoner for months. The detective handling our case said we'd stopped him just in time. The facility he'd arranged to send me to had been investigated multiple times for abuse and neglect. My school was surprisingly supportive once they learned the truth. Ms. Rodriguez, my English teacher, came to visit with months of missed assignments and a plan to help me catch up. "You can graduate with your class," she promised. "We'll make it work." She cried when she saw me, remembering how she'd visited months ago and believed Steve's lies about my treatment. The hardest part was dealing with all the people who'd believed him. Aunt Sarah couldn't stop apologizing for not seeing through his act. The neighbors brought casseroles and cards, their faces guilty when they remembered how they'd ignored my cries for help. Even Jenny from chemistry class came by, tears streaming down her face as she recalled the day Steve had convinced her I was dangerous. Dad tried to sell the house, thinking the memories would be too painful, but I refused. "This is Mom's house," I said firmly. "I won't let Steve take that from us, too." Instead, we renovated, painted the walls bright colors, rearranged furniture, turned his old office into a library. The dogs watched us work, their tails wagging as we reclaimed our space. As weeks turned into months, life started finding a new rhythm. Steve's trial was approaching, and with it came a flood of emotions I wasn't prepared for. The prosecutor, Ms. Martinez, spent hours with me going over my testimony. She was patient, kind, but firm about what I'd need to do. "Your story needs to be heard," she said, showing me the growing file of Steve's past victims who'd come forward after hearing about my case. The dogs became my strength during prep sessions. Zeus would rest his head on my lap when talking got too hard, while Apollo would nudge my hand whenever my voice started shaking. They seemed to know exactly when I needed support. Ms. Martinez was amazed by their transformation. "They're going to be our secret weapon in court," she said. "Their change from weapons to protectors shows exactly what kind of man Steve really is." Dad struggled with the upcoming trial, too. His own testimony would reveal how completely Steve had manipulated him, how his grief over Mom had blinded him to the danger right in front of him. I caught him practicing his statement late at night, his voice breaking as he detailed every red flag he'd missed. The dogs would split their time between us during these nights, one staying with me, one going to comfort Dad. My journal became crucial evidence. Every detailed entry, every documented lie, every recorded conversation painted a picture of calculated abuse that was impossible to deny. The prosecution particularly focused on his attempts to access Mom's insurance policy. "He didn't just imprison you," Ms. Martinez explained. "He was setting up for something much worse." The media attention grew as the trial date approached. Reporters camped outside our house, wanting the story of the girl who turned attack dogs against her captor. Most of them got it wrong, sensationalizing details, making it sound like some kind of revenge tale. They didn't understand that it had never been about revenge. It was about survival, about turning tools of fear into instruments of freedom. My school friends rallied around me, especially Jenny. She'd formed a support group of sorts, making sure I was never alone in the hallways between classes. The dogs had to stay home during school hours, but knowing my friends had my back helped ease the anxiety. Even the tough days when whispers and stares followed me through the halls became bearable with them by my side. Linda became a regular fixture in our lives, filling the mom-shaped hole that had been aching since we lost Mom. She'd bring dinner over, help me with homework, and most importantly, share stories about Mom that made her feel close again. "Your mother would be so proud," she'd say, watching me work with the dogs. "You've got her strength, you know." The dogs' transformation continued to amaze everyone. The same trainer who'd initially recommended they be put down now used them as examples in his classes. These dogs prove that aggression is taught, not innate. he'd explain, while Zeus and Apollo demonstrated their gentle obedience. They'd become ambassadors of sorts, helping rehabilitate other dogs rescued from abusive situations. As the trial got closer, my nightmares got worse. I'd wake up screaming, convinced I was locked in that room again. But now, instead of Steve's cruel commands outside my door, I'd hear the gentle whine of Zeus and Apollo, their warm presence grounding me in reality. Dad would come running too, no longer the helpless figure Steve had reduced him to, but the strong father I remembered from before. The hardest part was preparing to face Steve again. Ms. Martinez warned me he'd try to play the concerned stepfather, that he'd probably have some explanation for everything. But we have something he doesn't, she reminded me. We have the truth, and we have Zeus and Apollo, living proof of how his weapons turned against him. During one particularly tough prep session, I broke down trying to describe the day Steve first locked my door. Zeus immediately pressed against my side, while Apollo fetched my water bottle, something they'd learned to do when I got overwhelmed. Ms. Martinez watched in amazement. "This," she said, "this right here is what the jury needs to see. These aren't vicious animals. They're protectors who chose love over fear." Dr. Chen helped me prepare mentally for the trial. We worked on grounding techniques, ways to stay calm while telling my story. "Remember," she'd say, "you're not that trapped girl anymore. You're the one who saved herself, and those dogs, through intelligence and compassion." The dogs would lie at my feet during therapy sessions, their steady presence a reminder of how far we'd all come. One evening, going through old photos for the prosecution, Dad found a picture from right after Steve moved in. In it, Zeus and Apollo stood stiffly on either side of Steve, their eyes focused solely on him. We compared it to a recent photo. The dogs sprawled on our couch, relaxed and happy, one with his head in my lap, the other leaning against Dad's legs. The transformation was stunning. They were prisoners too, I realized aloud. He trapped them just like he trapped me, with fear and control. Dad hugged me then, really hugged me, for the first time since everything happened. We stood there crying together while the dogs pressed close, our strange little family healing together. That night, I added a final entry to my journal, not for the trial, but for myself. I wrote about transformation, about how love could overcome fear, about how the very things meant to keep me captive had become the keys to my freedom. Zeus and Apollo watched me write, their eyes full of understanding. We were all survivors, all warriors, all proof that even the darkest intentions could be transformed by love and courage. The trial was a week away, and I was ready. Ready to face Steve, ready to tell my story, ready to show the world that his greatest weapons had become his ultimate undoing. The dogs would be right there with me, living testimony to the power of breaking free from fear. We had all changed. Dad, the dogs, me. Steve hadn't broken us. He'd forced us to become stronger than he could have ever imagined. The first day of the trial felt surreal. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras, but I barely noticed them. My focus was entirely on Zeus and Apollo, who had been specially permitted to accompany me as support animals. They walked perfectly beside me, their presence keeping me grounded as we made our way through the chaos. Steve sat at the defense table, looking smaller somehow in his orange jumpsuit. When he saw me enter with the dogs, his face twisted with rage before quickly smoothing into that familiar, concerned expression. But he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes when Zeus and Apollo walked past him without even a glance, completely ignoring their former master's presence. Ms. Martinez's opening statement was powerful in its simplicity. She laid out Steve's pattern, how he'd targeted grieving families before, how he'd isolated his victims, how he'd used Mom's insurance policy as motivation. But when she got to the dogs, her voice took on a special intensity. "These animals," she said, gesturing to Zeus and Apollo lying calmly at my feet, "were turned from weapons of fear into instruments of freedom through nothing but patience and kindness. Their transformation reveals the truth about the defendant's character more clearly than any testimony could." Steve's lawyer tried to spin everything, claiming I was truly unstable, that Steve was just a concerned stepfather doing his best to help a troubled teen. He talked about Steve's investment expertise, his plans to use Mom's insurance money for my treatment, his dedication to training the dogs to protect me. But every lie fell flat in the face of the evidence. The prosecution's case was devastating. They had Steve's emails discussing other potential targets, other grieving single parents with significant life insurance policies. They had testimonies from his previous victims, though none had been imprisoned as long as I had. They had the illegal pills he'd been giving me, traced back to an online pharmacy with a history of selling counterfeit medications. But the strongest evidence was my journal. As I read entries from those months of captivity, my voice grew stronger with each page. I described the progressive isolation, the manipulation, the way Steve turned everyone against me. When I got to the parts about the dogs, about discovering their capacity for gentleness despite their harsh training, I saw several jurors wiping away tears. The dogs were supposed to be my prison guards, I testified, reaching down to touch Zeus's head, but they taught me something important, that even something meant for cruelty could choose kindness instead. They were victims too, forced to be weapons until someone showed them they could be something else. The defense tried to cross-examine me, to trip me up with questions about my mental state, about my behavior after Mom died. But I stayed calm, the dog's steady presence giving me strength. When Steve's lawyer suggested I had trained the dogs to be aggressive toward Steve, I simply demonstrated their perfect obedience, their gentle nature. They're not aggressive toward anyone, I explained. They just know the difference between protection and abuse now. Dad's testimony was heartbreaking. He broke down describing how Steve had manipulated his grief, used his love for me as a weapon against both of us. I failed my daughter, he said, his voice shaking. I let my own pain blind me to her suffering. During a break, I found him crying in the hallway. Zeus immediately went to him, offering the same comfort he'd given me so many times. The trainer who'd evaluated Zeus and Apollo testified about their remarkable rehabilitation. In my 20 years of working with dogs, he said, I've never seen animals so completely transform. These dogs weren't born violent. They were trained to be weapons. The fact that they could be retrained so completely, could learn to trust again, shows their true nature. Linda's testimony about finding me that day was powerful. She described how the dogs, supposedly vicious guard animals, had stood protectively beside me instead of attacking the police. They weren't protecting her captivity anymore, she said. They were protecting her freedom. The prosecution's final piece of evidence was a video, compiled from my secret phone recordings of Steve's training sessions with the dogs. His harsh commands, the way he'd trained them to intimidate and threaten, contrasted sharply with recent footage of Zeus and Apollo working as therapy dogs, gently helping scared kids at the treatment center. Steve took the stand in his own defense, trying to maintain his concerned stepfather act. But he cracked under cross-examination. When Ms. Martinez asked him to command the dogs, to demonstrate his control over them, Zeus and Apollo didn't even look up at his harsh German orders. Instead, they stayed calmly by my side, ignoring him completely. They're not your weapons anymore, I said quietly, loud enough for only the first few rows to hear. Steve's face contorted with rage, and for a moment his mask slipped completely. The jury saw it, that flash of the real person behind the caring facade. In that moment, I knew we had won. As we waited for the jury to deliberate, I sat in a conference room with Dad, Linda, and the dogs. Zeus had his head in my lap while Apollo leaned against Dad's legs. We were all exhausted, but there was a sense of peace too. Whatever the verdict, we had told our truth. We had shown the world who Steve really was. You did it, sweetheart, Linda said, squeezing my hand. You all did it. She was looking at the dogs too, acknowledging their part in exposing Steve's true nature. Dad just held my other hand, words failing him. But he didn't need to speak. We had all been broken by Steve in different ways, but we were healing together. The dogs had shown us how, by choosing love over fear, protection over imprisonment, truth over manipulation. When the bailiff came to tell us the jury had reached a verdict, I stood up straight and proud, Zeus and Apollo flanking me like the guardians they had become. We were ready to face whatever came next, together. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. As we filed back into the courtroom, Zeus and Apollo stayed pressed against my legs, their presence steady and reassuring. Steve stood stiffly at the defense table, his facade finally cracking as he watched his former weapons choose, once again, to protect me instead of him. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom again and again as the jury foreman read out each charge. False imprisonment, attempted fraud, animal cruelty, child abuse. The list went on, each guilty another brick in the wall between Steve and freedom. I didn't realize I was crying until Zeus gently nudged my hand with his nose, while Apollo leaned harder against my leg. Steve's explosion at the verdict was the final proof of his true nature. "Those are my dogs!" he screamed, lunging toward me. But Zeus and Apollo didn't even growl. They simply moved to stand between us, calm but alert, showing everyone the difference between aggression and protection. The bailiffs dragged Steve away, his shouts echoing down the hallway about how he'd done it all for my own good. The sentencing hearing a week later was almost harder than the trial. I had to read my victim impact statement, explaining how Steve's actions had affected my life. The worst part wasn't the isolation, I told the judge, my voice steady despite my shaking hands. It was watching him turn everyone I loved against me, making them believe I was the dangerous one. He didn't just imprison my body, he tried to imprison my soul. Dad's statement brought the whole courtroom to tears. He talked about Mom, about how Steve had weaponized his grief, about the guilt he'd carry forever for not protecting me. "I lost my wife," he said, his voice breaking, "and then I almost lost my daughter because I was too blind to see the monster hiding behind a caring smile." The judge's sentence was severe, 20 years without possibility of parole. "This court has seen many cases of abuse," she said, looking directly at Steve, "but few have shown such calculated cruelty, such methodical manipulation. You didn't just imprison a grieving teenager, you tried to erase her entire existence, to make her disappear while profiting from her pain." When she addressed the dog's role in the case, her voice softened. "Perhaps the most telling evidence of your true character," she told Steve, "is how quickly your instruments of fear chose to become instruments of protection when shown the slightest kindness. These animals have demonstrated more humanity than you ever did." The aftermath of the trial brought a different kind of chaos. Our story had caught national attention, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk about the girl who turned attack dogs against her abuser. But they all missed the point. It was never about turning the dogs against Steve. It was about showing them they had a choice, that they could protect instead of threaten. The publicity had one positive outcome. Other victims of similar schemes started coming forward. Steve, it turned out, had attempted variations of his plan before, though he'd never gone as far as he had with me. Support groups formed, connecting families who'd been manipulated during their grief. Dad found some peace in helping other parents spot the red flags he'd missed. Zeus and Apollo became somewhat famous in their own right. The story of their transformation from attack dogs to therapy animals inspired a program at the local shelter, rehabilitating abused dogs through gentle training and patience. I started volunteering there, showing other scared, aggressive dogs that they had the same choice my boys had made. The hardest part came when we finally cleaned out Steve's office. Among his papers, we found detailed plans for what would have happened after he had me committed. The facility he'd chosen had a history of keeping patients heavily medicated, isolated from family. He'd planned to access Mom's insurance money within months, leaving me trapped in a chemical prison while he moved on to his next target. Dad broke down completely when we found Steve's other research. Files on other grieving families, other single parents with life insurance policies, other vulnerable targets. "I brought him into our lives," Dad sobbed, clutching Mom's picture. "I gave him the power to hurt you." Zeus and Apollo worked together then, one comforting Dad while the other stayed with me, showing us again how far they'd come from their days as weapons. Our home slowly transformed too. We repainted every room, erasing the dark colors Steve had chosen. The dog's harsh training equipment was replaced with soft beds and toys. Their German command training was gradually replaced with gentle English words. though they still responded to my quiet blibe when they needed reassurance. Dr. Chin helped us understand that healing wouldn't be linear. There would be good days and bad days, moments of triumph and moments of tears. The dogs seemed to understand this instinctively, adjusting their support based on what we needed: playful energy on good days, quiet comfort on hard ones. One afternoon, about a month after the trial, I found Dad in the backyard with both dogs, teaching them new tricks with treats and praise. The sight of him laughing as Apollo rolled over dramatically for a belly rub brought tears to my eyes. These were the same dogs that Steve had turned into weapons, now bringing joy and healing to the family they'd once been trained to terrorize. That night, I added one final entry to my journal, not about Steve or the trial, but about transformation, about how love could overcome fear, how protection could replace imprisonment, how even the deepest wounds could heal with time and patience. Zeus and Apollo lay at my feet as I wrote, their presence a constant reminder that sometimes the things meant to break us become the very things that make us strongest. 1 year after Steve's sentencing, our lives had found a new normal. The media attention finally died down, letting us heal in peace. Zeus and Apollo had become certified therapy dogs, working with trauma survivors at the local crisis center. Watching them comfort scared kids and anxious adults, it was hard to believe they were once trained to intimidate and threaten. I graduated high school on time, thanks to Ms. Rodriguez and my other teachers' support. During the ceremony, Zeus and Apollo sat proudly in the audience with Dad and Linda, wearing special graduation bandanas. When I walked across the stage to get my diploma, their happy barks made everyone laugh. It wasn't the normal graduation experience, but then again, nothing about our journey had been normal. Dad had changed too. The guilt still weighed on him, but he'd found purpose in helping other families avoid similar situations. He started a support group for grieving parents, teaching them to recognize manipulation tactics like the ones Steve had used. We can't change the past, he'd tell them, but we can protect others from making the same mistakes. The house that had once been my prison became a sanctuary. We hosted monthly gatherings for other survivors of abuse, with Zeus and Apollo acting as furry therapists. The dogs seemed to have a sixth sense about who needed them most, gravitating toward the quietest person in the room, offering silent comfort to those struggling to speak their truth. Linda became a permanent part of our family, eventually moving into the guest house after retiring from the police force. She started a program training law enforcement to better recognize signs of domestic abuse and imprisonment. Sometimes she'd bring Zeus and Apollo to her presentations, using their story to show how abusers use isolation and fear to maintain control. The dogs' rehabilitation program at the local shelter was thriving. Every success story, every aggressive dog that learned to trust again, felt like another small victory over Steve's legacy of fear. I spent weekends there, showing scared dogs that they had the same choice Zeus and Apollo had made. They could choose protection over aggression, love over fear. My nightmares became less frequent, though they never completely disappeared. On bad nights, when I'd wake up gasping, thinking I was locked in that room again, I'd find Zeus and Apollo already alert and ready to comfort me. Their presence reminded me that I wasn't that helpless girl anymore. We had all transformed together. College acceptance letters started arriving, including one from a veterinary program that had heard our story. They were interested in my experience rehabilitating traumatized animals, offering me a scholarship to study animal behavior and therapy. The decision to go wasn't easy. The thought of leaving home, leaving Dad and the dogs, brought back echoes of old fears. But Dad surprised me. He found a small house near campus, perfect for me and the dogs. "They're your protectors now," he said, helping me move in. "They chose you, and honestly, I'll feel better knowing they're with you." Zeus and Apollo adapted to college life better than I did, becoming unofficial mascots of my dorm building. On quiet evenings, I'd sometimes think about Steve sitting in his prison cell. I wondered if he ever realized how completely his plan had backfired. He'd tried to use the dogs to imprison me, but they had become the key to my freedom. He'd tried to isolate me from everyone who loved me, but instead, he'd helped create a stronger, wider family of survivors and supporters. The final piece of healing came unexpectedly. A year into college, I received a letter from another of Steve's victims, a girl whose father he had married years before targeting us. She'd been too scared to testify at the trial, but our story had given her the courage to finally speak out. "You and those dogs showed me that we don't have to let fear win," she wrote. "We can choose to be protectors instead of victims." That letter inspired me to start writing a book about our experience, not focused on Steve's cruelty, but on the transformation that followed. About how Zeus and Apollo taught me that even the deepest wounds could heal, that weapons could become protectors, that love could overcome the darkest training. Dad helped me with the difficult parts, and Linda added her professional insights. The book's final chapter described a scene from my first year of college, Zeus and Apollo, now therapy dogs extraordinaire, helping a group of abuse survivors find their voices again. One small girl, silent for months after her own trauma, finally spoke, not to her therapist or family, but to Apollo as he gently rested his head in her lap. "The dogs weren't born mean," she whispered, echoing the truth I'd learned during those dark months. "Someone taught them to be scary, but they learned to be kind instead." Today, our story serves as a reminder that transformation is always possible. Zeus and Apollo, once trained to keep me captive, now work full-time helping others break free from their own prisons of fear. Dad leads workshops on recognizing and preventing abuse, his past mistakes becoming valuable lessons for others. And me? I'm finishing my veterinary degree, specializing in rehabilitating traumatized animals. Steve tried to break us all. Me, Dad, even the dogs. Instead, he gave us the opportunity to rebuild something stronger. Our family grew beyond blood ties, encompassing all those who understood our journey from fear to freedom. Zeus and Apollo taught us the most important lesson, that even things meant for darkness can choose to serve the light. Every night before bed, the dogs still follow their old routine, checking the house, making sure everyone is safe. But now they do it out of love, not fear. Their patrol ends in my room, one on each side of my bed, protecting me not because they're forced to, but because they choose to. And in that choice lies the true victory over everything Steve tried to do to us. We are all protectors now, in our own ways, and that, more than any revenge, is the perfect ending to our story.